Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 39 of On the Road with AutoTrader, where we make car stuff simple for Canadians. My name is Jody Lai, and I'm the editor-in-chief of AutoTrader.
And I am Dan Alika. I am AutoTrader's road test editor.
Oh, you remembered your name this time.
Yeah, every once in a while, you know?
Yeah. So today, Dan and I are going to be talking about cars that were ahead of their time. So these were cars that were kind of like pioneering. They did something new back then, but didn't really get the love that they deserved because like people just weren't into that thing that they had.
Or then the other one is that it's like they didn't get any love, but then you look today and go, oh man, if that thing came out like this year,
Yep.
it would be a hit.
Yeah, absolutely. So like they were pioneers back then, and then now all of a sudden the thing they were offering is cool.
Yeah.
But back then it got no love. And there's surprisingly like a really long list of cars that kind of fall into this category.
This is also kind of like, I'm sure if we sat down, we could expand on this list and turn this into like a 6-hour episode.
Yeah, so we have
Like-
10 cars picked out. I don't know if we'll have time to go through all 10. But the first one that I always think about as being ahead of its time is the Pontiac Aztek.
Oh, hugely.
So it was around from 2001 to 2005, which is not a very long time.
Do you want to know something?
Yeah.
My parents owned one.
Did they?
Yeah.
Why did they buy it?
We needed something, so it's, we're a family of 4. So it was kind of when we got to that point where we didn't need a minivan anymore. It could tow 3,500 pounds, and we had a camper trailer, and it was perfect for that. It had load leveling suspension in the back, and it being just a 5-seater, like a 2-row. So there was lots of rear seat legroom for my brother and I. He was, I think, 14 and I was 13 when we got it. So it was kind of just like the right vehicle at the right time. And I don't know. It was just, yeah.
Yeah, so people back then, and I mean today, it still holds a reputation of being one of the ugliest vehicles
does.
to ever exist, which
Yeah.
I agree with. But if we kind of like squint our eyes and look at the shape that it presented, right? That like kind of sloping roof line with the hard cutoff,
Lots of cladding.
lots of body cladding, lots
Yeah.
of extra like headlight elements.
Yeah.
For the time, no one else was doing that.
No.
But today, that body style is everywhere.
Everywhere. Even if you don't want to admit it.
Yeah.
It basically was like a pioneer of like the SUV coupe, which I
Yeah.
hate that term so much. It's dumb. It's not a thing. But sloping, sport-backed SUV, yeah, the Aztek was it.
The Pontiac Aztek was like the BMW X6 before it was the X6,
Yeah.
right?
Or
and
the
now
GLE coupe.
now every major luxury automaker has one of these
Yeah.
SUVs that look kind of the same.
Yeah.
Based on the silhouette and like the body cladding and
Yeah.
even like all of those extra headlight elements, like it got roasted back then for having this weird dual layer headlight.
Yeah, and like the turn signals were up in the
Yeah.
corners. They were separate
and how many
units.
cars today do that?
Yeah.
It's everywhere. So I feel like if the Pontiac Aztek, with a couple tweaks, came out today,
Yeah.
it would actually be very
Yeah,
popular.
I agree. We also had the tent for the back of it, which was cool.
Oh, see,
Yeah.
that was also very pioneering for the
Yeah.
time. See, and it had all these great practical features, but
Yeah.
nobody gave it love because
Yeah.
it was too quick to arrive. It was definitely ahead of its time.
Absolutely.
But it is funny that it became kind of like a cult classic because of Breaking Bad.
The next one on the list that we were divided on in terms of like love, I think the Honda Accord Crosstour was super cool.
Okay.
Which was like this weird sportback. So it was an Accord in terms of like when you looked at it, you're like, oh, that looks like an Accord, but it was like had a little bit more ride height. It didn't have like cladding the way like the Aztek did, but like it was sort of, this elevated version, which I really like that. And then you were like, oh, and the Acura ZDX. And I was like, yuck.
Well, the ZDX and the Crosstour were based on the same vehicle, right? And
But just the platform, the styling
Yeah.
of the ZDX, I think, when you look at vehicles, you still see them every now and then.
Yeah.
And I do not think the ZDX is aging well.
No.
Which you see an Accord Crosstour, and it just looks like what it is. you know?
I mean, I think it's a little bit dorky, but here's where
easy.
I think it failed is because people back then didn't really know what it was. Was it a wagon? Was it an SUV? Was it a sedan? People didn't know, right? And so when people can't classify, when the people can't put something into a box, they're like a lot less likely to accept it. But it came with all-wheel drive, which was very unique for the time. Again, that like coupe-like SUV profile was very new. And I feel like if the Accord Crosstour came out now, it would be very popular. It'd be like the Crown that we talked about in the last episode, the Toyota Crown.
I think Honda was just, ahead of the game by 6 years or something like that. If it would have came out 6 years later, I think it would have been a lot more of a success, because it was a bit of a flop. Like it did not.
It was only around from 2010 to 2015, which is a very short amount of time for a new car.
Yeah, but like I said, if it was 2016 or 2020, I think it really would have done a lot more in terms of sales.
Well, especially because these vehicles that are geared towards more like outdoorsy types of drivers are super popular right now, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, all these trims, right?
Yeah.
Everybody that wants to project this, like, oh, look, I'm going into the woods.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're everywhere now. So I think the Crosstour was ahead of its time.
Yeah. So was the Subaru Baja.
The Baja, ha, ha, ha.
Yes. I did see, that's an actual license plate that I saw once.
I've seen it.
And I was like, that's the funniest license plate ever.
Yeah, it was hilarious.
I also want to, details for those of you who don't remember. What was that, 20 years ago?
So it was out from 2003 to 2006.
So 20 years ago. Subaru basically, just took an Outback and made this like compact pickup truck out of it.
Yeah, and so for its time, it was very unique because it was a car-based pickup truck with all-wheel drive.
Yeah.
Back then, pretty much didn't exist, right?
And it was 4 doors, which also made it unique because Subaru used to build the Brat back in the day, which was similarly, executed, but it was 2-door.
Right.
That one was also, it dodged the chicken tax in the U.S. by having those plastic jump seats in the back that were basically like Subaru knew. So it was a way to avoid these massive import taxes because trucks were there was an exception for trucks. I don't remember exactly how it worked, but anyways, it had to have 4 seats. And
right.
Subaru was like, oh man, what are we going to do? Because it's only a 2-seater. So they put these plastic jump seats, like the type of seats that you would find on one of those old sketchy, like off-road, like go-kart
like
type
just a
things.
Plastic little...
Like a plastic bucket seat.
Yeah.
It had 2 little handles that you would like grip onto and like seat belts. They were built so that you could just remove them.
Yeah.
But then they became a collector's item, and Brats with the seats were worth more because they kind of, made them that much more special.
Yeah.
I also want to tell a story about the Baja.
Okay.
So I worked at Subaru for a few years, and as part of, the role, and every once in a while you'd get to go to Japan to do what they call field work. So when a new vehicle is coming out, it's like kind of right before, let's say like 6-8 months before launch, you go over there, you drive the vehicle at the testing facility. They have a whole thing set up. You sit down with the engineers, you look at all the materials. It's just like an in-depth, look at the vehicle. And my VP at the time, Ted Lalka, who's now retired, was telling me about a trip to Japan back in 2002 for the Baja. Mm-hmm. And so they had their field day thing, their field work thing. They drove the vehicle, and there were representatives from Subaru of America as well as Subaru Canada. And at the end, they were sitting down with the project general manager asking some questions. And somebody from Subaru of America said, I really like it, but I'm wondering, is there going to be a cap available for it? And he sort of looked and didn't understand what a cap was, so somebody explained it to him, and then he conferred with one of his team members in Japanese, and they're having this kind of intense conversation, and then he turns back to the group and says, we already have a cap for it. And everyone in the room went, oh, and he paused for effect and then went, it's called the Outback. Meaning, if
Mic
you
drop.
want the cab, buy the Outback. If you want the open bed of the truck, you buy the Baja.
That's the whole purpose of it, right?
Yeah.
And so the real idea behind the Baja was to have pickup truck utility
Yes.
in a package that had a smaller footprint, was easy to drive, and was more efficient.
Yes.
That was way ahead of its time because nobody did it back then. But today we have vehicles like the Ford Maverick and the Santa Fe, which are also, you
Cruise.
guessed it.
Cruise.
Sorry, not the Santa Fe.
The Santa Fe is
The Santa
also
Cruz.
that, but then again, that also means that there's some confusion in the Hyundai lineup. So what's that all about?
Too many Santas.
No claws.
Yeah, exactly.
Too many Santas, not enough
And
clauses.
so now today we have a lot of these car-based pickup trucks. And so if the Baja came out today, I bet people would buy it.
Yeah, I just feel like, especially from a brand like Subaru,
It makes so much sense,
like
right?
what the hell?
Yeah.
Like it just, to me, it's a no-brainer. I said it when I was there, when I worked there, and I'm like, man, if there was a candidate for it, the Ascent would be the perfect one. Where I think, not the Outback is too small, but I just think like if you were to take an Ascent and modify it to serve as a pickup truck, a little bit longer, bed on the back, I think people would be like, oh, this thing's pretty cool.
I mean, especially because Subaru, like, they really cater to outdoorsy, adventurous people. And so I feel like that's a no-brainer for them, right? Yeah, makes so much sense.
Anyways.
This next one you brought up,
Oh,
actually,
yeah.
it's the Buick Regal TourX,
Yeah.
which was around from 2018 to 2020. We did not get it in Canada. For some reason, you could only buy one in the U.S. I was able to drive one because I worked for a U.S. publication at the time. It had only lasted 2 years, which is very
Yeah.
sad because it was very good. It had all-wheel drive. It had all body cladding.
Yeah.
Very much like a Subaru Outback, but
Yeah.
a bit more luxurious.
And like that Regal, the styling of it was fantastic, and it
It looked very
translated
pretty.
so well to a wagon.
Yep.
The one we got was the
Sedan?
Was this like was that like sportback,
Yeah.
coupey kind of sedan thing, and I remember when it came out, like every Canadian auto journalist went, "You gave us the wrong one."
Yeah.
Like if you were going to choose one and not the other, wagons tended to, not so much anymore, not just because they don't sell them, but just in general, wagons have fallen off. But like wagons always did better historically in Canada than they did in the US
That's
in
right.
terms of like a percentage of sales. So the fact that we got I can't even remember what the version of the Regal that we got was called, in addition to the regular sedan. But yeah, we didn't get that wagon, and I was like, this is just bizarre.
Yeah, so why was that ahead of its time?
I don't know. It's just like, if you take a look at, we talked about it in the last episode, like the Mercedes
Right.
E-Class All-Terrain. Now, the Audi A4 and A6 All-Road existed before that, but Buick has always occupied this weird in-between space. It's not quite premium, but it's also not mainstream, and it just... I don't know. I just feel like it's one of those vehicles that was kind of a crossover without being a full-fledged crossover, and those seem to be, it's like all these, SUV coupes these days. It seems to be all the rage that it's like, well, I want an SUV, but I don't really want an SUV. It's like, boom.
Yeah, then get yourself a wagon with all-wheel drive. It's perfect.
Yeah, I thought they were super cool.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. It's kind of a shame we never got it here.
Yeah.
Here's one that I don't know if a lot of people even remember, the Cadillac ELR.
Yep.
It was around from 2013 to 2016. What it was a two-door, very angular-looking plug-in hybrid. It had
Look.
60 kilometers of all-electric range, and it was based on the Chevrolet Volt, V-Volt.
Yes, V-Volt.
Yeah. And I think it failed because it came at a time when people did not give a crap about electrification.
It was also super expensive.
It was $35,000 more expensive than the Volt it was based on.
And it's not just that the powertrain was shared with the Volt. It was like the infotainment system and everything, like
Yeah.
the climate controls. It felt like a little bit of a dolled up Volt. And so
Yeah.
you're paying a lot of money for something that, was kind of a flop waiting to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And the timing was just so bad because
Yeah.
in 2013, nobody cared about electrification. Gas was cheap. nobody cared. And so it failed pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But it was definitely ahead of its time because today, luxury PHEVs are all the rage.
Yeah.
Every luxury automaker has a plug-in hybrid now. Maybe not in this weird body style. Like a plug-in hybrid coupe was kind of doomed to fail.
Ironically, you know what brand doesn't?
What?
Cadillac.
Yeah, I know.
Cadillac went, well, this didn't work.
That's
We're never
true.
doing it again.
So they went straight from having gas-powered vehicles to full electric. They
Yeah.
didn't even go back to plug-in hybrids,
No.
maybe because they were too salty about the previous experience.
Yeah. But
But definitely ahead of its time.
yeah, I think it was weird.
It
I
was
think
weird.
Poorly executed.
Yeah.
But, you know, another one, the BMW i3.
Yeah, so that was a little tiny electric vehicle that was around from 2014 to 2021, so not that long ago,
Yeah.
right? And I think in 2014 when it came out, it was ahead of its time because,
Yes.
again, at that time, nobody cared about electrification. But it was also very, like, weird looking
Yeah.
and, like, kind of dorky.
Yeah.
And I don't think people, if they weren't into electrification, they really weren't going to be into it if you looked like a dork driving one, right?
Yeah. it was really bizarre, but in a cool way. Remember, it was like, you know, it had real wood trim and like, it was like cool in terms of like sustainable materials. Like it was a big reach for BMW
Yeah.
to like be like, we're going to do something so different.
And they were one of the first to try experimenting with more sustainable materials.
Yeah.
Like nobody was using, I think they used bamboo trim.
Yeah,
No
it
one was doing
It was
that.
super cool, and I just think that. But yeah, if it came out, you know, now I think not that it would have done astronomically better in the sales charts, but I just think that people now are more receptive
Yes.
to like weirdness in the because I mean you could kind of say the same thing about the Prius.
Yeah.
You know, it was very odd, and it used to be the butt of so many jokes.
Yeah.
You know,
but
I
it-
remember a guy in California once driving a Prius, and it was like a quote on the back of his car, and then it was like "cool Prius," and it was attributed to no one ever, which I thought was such a funny
That's
sticker.
adorable.
Yeah.
But the BMW i3 wasn't really a flop globally. It kind of flopped
No,
in North
no.
America,
Yeah.
but globally they sold like 250,000 of them.
Oh, it was-
so
it
it was
was-
like popular in Europe and
Yeah.
stuff like that. But in North America, where people like big cars that were gas powered, it was just not very well timed.
And like the pizza cutter wheels, remember they were huge but really
very
narrow.
skinny, yeah.
Like anyways, that was a weird one.
but definitely ahead of its time.
And then we talked about the Prius when it first came out. So the other one to talk about is the Honda Insight.
Well, the first gen Honda Insight
Yeah.
came out in 2000 and was around until 2006. And what's funny about the first gen Honda Insight is that it got here before the Prius. So the Prius usually gets credited as being the first hybrid vehicle, but that's incorrect. It's actually the Honda
now it
Insight.
was within
7 months.
Yeah, like, and the Insight, I don't know if you guys remember the first one, but it was this little hatch. It was sort of like a modern take on the CRX in a weird way, and it had those fairings over the back wheels.
So yeah, so it covered a portion of the rear wheels for
Yeah.
better aerodynamics.
Yeah.
And again, like I don't think people were really ready to have a fuel efficient vehicle that looked so weird at the time.
And then related to it was the Honda's CRZ.
Yeah, but I wanted to talk a
Oh,
little bit
sorry.
more about why the Insight was ahead of its time,
Oh.
right? So first of all, now cars like this are everywhere. Hybrid, affordable hybrid compact sedans. But it was also, it came with a manual transmission at first. The first couple years it was available in Canada, it was a manual transmission hybrid vehicle, which like does not exist. But
I remember the CRZ with the manual.
that one also had a manual, but the CVT was, I think for Honda, it debuted in the Insight. And back
Oh.
then, CVTs were almost nowhere to be found. And today, they're everywhere.
Everywhere.
So I think the Insight was ahead of its time for many reasons.
Fair, yeah.
But the timing was off because just people weren't ready for it at that time.
And then getting to the CRZ, yeah. So this was actually the spiritual successor to the CRX, both in terms of styling and the fact that you could get it with a manual. So it was a sporty hybrid.
Yeah, and that was around from 2010 to 2016.
Yeah, they were cool.
They were really cool.
I remember wanting one, but I remember like the infotainment system was junk.
Yeah,
and it just
but
didn't really work for me.
so I think the CR, that car was ahead of its time because it blended sportiness and efficiency, right? And back then, nobody was really into that, but today, that's a very common thing to see.
Yeah.
So again, if it came out today, it might have done better.
You know what all of this reminds me, and this is kind of like a, it falls in between the episode of cars that were ahead of their time, and, just like kind of cars that we wish never went away or whatever.
Right.
Remember the Toyota Prius V?
Oh yeah, it was like a not a minivan, but like a wagon-ish kind of version of the Prius.
Yeah. Yeah, it was like it was sort of like a Kia Rondo, but not quite. It was like this weird in between. It didn't have sliding doors. It was four full.
But it was very roomy.
Or did it have sliding doors?
I don't think it did.
No, I don't think so. But anyways, I just remember now. I'm like seeing the Rondo in my head. And,
yeah,
and
you're thinking of the Mazda.
Oh, the Mazda 5?
Yes,
Yeah.
that had sliding doors on it.
But yeah, the Prius V, and that was another one. I seriously considered it, but the infotainment and remember the little shifter, the little gear selector in the Prius from that generation, and I was like, I couldn't live with this thing.
The little nubby thing.
Yeah, and it was not from like a user friendliness perspective.
It's too radical for the time, I think.
But I think so. It wasn't really ahead of its time because I don't think that people would buy it now if it came out.
No, it's way too
But
niche.
It was like super cool.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Let's just call that a list of super cool cars that aren't really cool.
Well, some of these, cool. Yeah, I don't know. So, like, this one was very interesting. The Suzuki SX4.
That was way ahead of its time.
So, it was out from 2006 to 2013. It was a little hatchback, but it was unique at the time because it offered all-wheel drive. And back then, no hatchback offered all-wheel drive.
Well, before that, in fairness, and it was smaller, but Subaru had the Justy. Right.
Okay. So similar thing, but
in that era, yeah, it was very unique. It was its own thing. It sold reasonably well, and it was cool in a way. It was like, because remember Suzuki was really into like the Pikes Peak thing, like the hill climb, and this was kind of like the consumer-driven manifestation of like, how do we take like this little hatchback that we're building to do this, you know, to rip up this mountain and do it in something that people would actually buy.
Yeah, and so at the time, really the only way you can get four-wheel drive or all-wheel drive is if you got an SUV. And so they wanted to give Canadian drivers something with that added traction, but, you know, not such a big footprint. And it came at a time when subcompact crossovers did not exist.
Yeah.
That's a very today thing.
I think like the thing to remember about this is like, okay, so Subaru sold the Impreza back then as a hatchback, but the Crosstrek didn't exist. And this, again, is where one of those things where the SX4, it wasn't like jacked up and like, you know, you could take it on a rough trail, but it was a little more of a precursor to a crossover and not just another hatchback is the way I would kind of look at it. Yeah.
Super ahead of its time.
Yeah.
Because today, you know, subcompact crossovers are all the rage. Like we said in a previous episode, they're basically replacing compact hatchbacks.
Yeah.
So very ahead of its time. The Suzuki brand did not last very long here, unfortunately.
Yeah, that bums me out, I think. Like, I remember that was a victim of, like, the recession.
Yes.
And, you know, it hung on for much longer than I think people, like, it was kind of on life support for a long time.
Yeah.
And then finally went away. But I think you can still buy Suzuki trucks in Canada, I think.
I think so, yeah.
Kind of...
like commercial trucks.
Yeah, and not very big ones, like cab over style, smaller, and they're cool. But yeah, you don't see Suzukis around anymore.
But it's interesting because I remember at the time, like I was working in the industry back then, so I remember like reviews coming out for Suzukis that were out at the time, and people like generally really loved them. They thought like this is a very solid vehicle, very good value.
Remember the Kazashi?
Kazashi, that was great.
The styling of that, wow. That thing was awesome, and I think it was available with all-wheel drive.
I think it was, yeah. Another vehicle that was ahead of its time.
Honorable mention to the Suzuki Kazashi.
Good job.
Last one, good job.
Good job, Suzuki.
last one on the list, which is like a way back playback here, is the AMC Eagle. So American Motor Car,
Yes.
I think was the
This
was the acronym.
Around from 1980 to 1987.
It was, and now this one's hard because Subaru existed. Subaru built the Leone or whatever it was called, was available in a wagon and a sedan with four-wheel drive. I've been to a Subaru museum in Japan where you can see all of these like old 70s,
Cool.
slightly jacked up four-wheel drive cars. But for the North American market, because the first one that we got was the Legacy, I believe, in terms of like having that four-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. But the AMC Eagle was available as a sedan as well as a wagon, and it was like a jacked up car with four-wheel drive.
Yeah, and so it's widely recognized as the first crossover at a time when the word crossover didn't even exist. And so it was really pioneering in that sense.
I think it's widely recognized as the first crossover in the most literal sense.
Yes.
It, like, now we call crossovers anything that isn't like a body on frame SUV. But this is like the kind of, just like boiling it down to like, it is a cross between a car and an SUV.
Yeah.
It's a crossover.
Yeah.
But like, that's not the sense that we, use that term anymore.
No, not at all. But the objective for that vehicle was that it was supposed to have affordable all-wheel drive, comfortable car-like ride and handling, light off-road capability. Sound familiar? It's like every single outdoorsy focused vehicle that's on sale today.
It's crazy. That thing
The
was
Wilderness Outback, boom.
Yeah, way ahead of its time.
Yeah.
You still see them every now and then at like quirky car shows because it's not like a classic in terms of like a collector. People love them, but the people who love them do really love them. The sedans you don't see as much as the wagons, but yeah, there were sedans. I feel like there was even a coupe version of the Eagle.
That was jacked up and had all-wheel drive? Yeah. That's cool. I think you're right, actually.
Yeah. I always remember like, seeing them around when I was a kid and thinking they were pretty neat and like, yeah. But I'm telling you, anybody out there listening that, wants to do a little digging, there's like a cool history with Subaru and older models. And back in those days, I remember like even the Justy, which was available, like you could buy that in Canada through like the mid 90s or something. But those older Subarus had like a button activated all-wheel drive system, and some of them were like on top of the gear stick.
Cool.
I'd also like to give an honorable mention to a car that was ahead of its time, and there's a whole bunch, but the Toyota Tercel four-wheel drive wagon was super cool, and that was like a really quirky design. Remember, it was kind of tall, and it had like the rounded glass at the top, and like it was. Anyways, that was a really cool. That was like a pre-Crosstrek.
Cool.
Yeah. Anyways.
Yeah. Wow, there's so many of these.
Like I said, this could be a 6-hour episode.
I know.
We could just go crazy.
Yeah, there were so many cars that were like good but poorly timed. It would be interesting to revisit this list in like 10 or 20 more years to see what
Put
it
her
would
in the
look
time
like.
capsule, Jones.
Yeah. We'll revisit this. Before today's Ask an Expert segment, here's a message from the good people at AutoTrader. Save time and money by using AutoTrader, Canada's most trusted place to buy and sell new and used cars. AutoTrader has the most cars, and one of the best features is price badging, so you can feel more confident that you're getting a good deal. So today's Ask an Expert comes from Garrett from Guelph.
Greetings, Garrett.
What is that new car smell, and is there a way I can replicate it?
I mean, I know there are, air fresheners that claim to be the new car smell, and, not just like the cardboard air fresheners, but like little cartridges.
There's like sprays and stuff.
Yeah, it's never going to be exactly the same because it is essentially the newness of like all of the plastics and the adhesives and they all, and like, as they wear, it's just like, I don't know, let's say you bought a leather jacket and like when you first get it, or a purse or a wallet, there's that smell, and then over time with use, it just kind of goes away.
Yeah, so that's a process called off-gassing. And that's basically when these new plastics and adhesives just kind of like release those chemicals in vapor form. Like, it's not enough to be toxic or anything.
In large quantities.
Well, you don't want to like sit there in the heat with your windows up, like huffing that stuff.
Or you do. I don't know.
Depends what you're into, I guess.
Yeah.
But, what happens when you paint a room, for example.
Yes. But
same kind of process.
But yeah, replicating it. It's also funny how different each brand, like Mercedes has always had a very distinct smell that I've always kind of equated to like baked goods.
But they have those like little air fresheners.
Oh, I don't mean those. I mean like just like
just comes smelling
adhesives
like,
and stuff like that have this like smell. Because some brands, try to reduce or eliminate altogether like toxic chemicals. It's also why like wiring harnesses and stuff like that, and like the actual like jacket on the wiring, it can be made from. It's why animals like to eat them, because it's like biodegradable like byproducts. Right. And so that also is going to be part of it. You've got all this new wiring that's off-gassing, so it leads to these like this mix of smells that's like that new car smell is one of like the kind of secondary benefits of buying a new car.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny though, because when I was doing the research for this episode, I read that in China, people did not like new car smell because they thought it was pollution.
Oh.
And so they like did a bunch of research to try to figure out how to eliminate the new car smell in China, but
They're
still have the new car smell in North America.
Paying people to hack darts and sit in their dirty jeans on the seats until the smell's gone.
Yeah, I don't know.
They can gladly send all that new car smell to me.
Just bottle it up and
I'd
package
take
it. Yeah.
Just a little sniff every once in a while.
Yep.
You could get some good mileage out of that. Anyways.
Thank you, Garrett, for your question. If any of you have any questions that you would like to ask Dan or I, you can email expert@trader.ca. And that wraps up this episode. So drive safe, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everybody.